Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, if it is that where you are. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and I am really happy to welcome Ngozi Okidegbe as part of our series on bias in AI. Before I introduce her, I'll just say do a little bit of advertising about the series. She's our next to last speaker. The last speaker will be on April 6th. It'll be Karen Levy from Cornell University. She's a sociologist who has just finished writing a book on automation in the trucking industry. And I've heard her talk a little bit about what went into this. And she's like, yep, I was reading trucker magazines and hanging out with people. So it's a very sort of fieldworky and detailed account of just what it means to try to automate an industry that depends on people. So that'll be on April the 6th. And I highly commend Karen as a speaker to you. It'll be at 1 o'clock, the same time as this talk. We've also had other speakers here. We've had Alex Hanna, Ben Green, Serena Wang. Those talks are all archived on the center's YouTube channel, so they're accessible to you if you'd like to see them. Okay, so Ngozi Okidegbe is a law professor currently at the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University in New York. I'll let her tell you where she'll be soon. But the paper today, or the presentation, is based on a paper called Discredited Data, and I will let her introduce it further from there. So, Ngozi, all yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Gordon, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak as part of this series on bias AI. And thank you all for attending the talk. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I come at this topic as a criminal law and critical race theory scholar. My work explores the relationship between predictive technologies used in criminal legal institutions and racial justice. Specifically, I study the harms that these technologies enact on racially marginalized communities. And it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today about my research. The focus of this talk will be on algorithmic discrimination. Specifically, I seek to complicate the dominant understanding of algorithmic discrimination. For the reasons I will lay out in my talk, algorithmic discrimination is not only caused by biased data. It's also caused by the fact that algorithmic systems are built and trained exclusively with data derived from criminal legal institutions, or what I call carceral knowledge sources. Dismantling the dominance of carceral knowledge sources in the construction of algorithmic systems is a prerequisite for the creation of algorithms that have the possibility to produce different and potentially equitable outcomes. And though I'm focused on pretrial algorithms in this talk and in the paper that this talk is based on, the discussion applies to other predictive technologies as well. In terms of a roadmap, my talk will be divided into 5 parts. First, I will briefly discuss the increased utilization of pretrial algorithms. Then I will lay out the problem of algorithmic discrimination and show how the exclusive use of carceral knowledge sources is one cause of it. I will then lay out the dominant understanding of algorithmic discrimination, which is the biased data diagnosis, and show how approaches flowing from this dominant understanding have been unable to redress the issue. I will then sketch out a proposal for addressing algorithmic discrimination, which consists of dismantling the dominance of carceral knowledge sources in algorithmic construction and moving toward non-carceral knowledge sources. I'll end my talk by highlighting some of the objections that might be levied against this proposal. So as background, each year, millions of defendants are subjected to a pretrial hearing that will determine if they're released before trial. For many, that determination will be affected by a pretrial algorithm. This is because across the country, jurisdictions are turning to these algorithms as a popular response to the problem of racialized mass pretrial incarceration. These algorithms tend to be risk assessment algorithms, and they use a statistical method and information about a defendant to determine the probability that that defendant will fail to appear or will be arrested for a pretrial crime if released pending trial. The predictions or risk scores produced by these algorithms are used as a factor for determining the defendant's eligibility for pretrial release, as well as for determining pretrial release conditions. The increased use of pretrial algorithms is part of a growing movement to use data-informed predictive technologies to redress racial and socioeconomic biases that have ushered in racialized mass pretrial incarceration. And the pretrial system is a part of the story of racialized mass incarceration. Bail determinations are often more predicated on a defendant's race and socioeconomic status than on their risk to public safety or the administration of the criminal legal system. And there is a growing social movement around redressing the racial and class inequities of the pretrial system. And one of the objectives of employing pretrial algorithms is to fix the fact that the pretrial system incarcerates a staggering number of racially marginalized and socioeconomically disadvantaged defendants like Khalif Browder and Sandra Bland, who I have both on the slide, and whose release poses little or no danger to public safety or the administration of the criminal legal system. Proponents of pretrial algorithms claim that the increased use of pretrial algorithms responds to this problem. They claim that the increased use of this technology will reduce existing inequities in the pretrial system by enabling bail judges to identify and release defendants who are at a low statistical risk of committing pretrial misconduct. The aim is to reduce the pretrial detention population by ensuring that only those who are at a high risk for pretrial misconduct are detained, while those who are at a low risk of pretrial misconduct are released either on their own recognizance or with pretrial release conditions. However, the increased utilization of pretrial algorithms has not reduced the overrepresentation of racially marginalized and socioeconomically disadvantaged defendants in pretrial detention. In fact, as critics of pretrial algorithms feared, the use of pretrial algorithms has tended to operate to reproduce and entrench existing inequities. This is because these algorithms tend to overestimate the riskiness of racially marginalized defendants while underestimating the riskiness of defendants that are racialized as white. This leads the algorithm to disproportionately mislabel racially marginalized defendants as at a high risk for pretrial misconduct and results in them being given higher risk scores. At the same time, this problem leads the algorithm to disproportionately mislabel white defendants as at a low risk for committing pretrial misconduct. White defendants are resultingly disproportionately given lower risk scores. And this racial disparity has been documented. On the PowerPoint slide, I've included photos from the ProPublica report on the racial disparity in risk classification and in risk scores assigned in regard to the COMPAS algorithm. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and discussion portion of this. And so it has become clear that algorithmic discrimination is a problem impacting pretrial algorithms. Enacting jurisdictions are noticing that pretrial algorithms are facilitating existing racial and socioeconomic inequities. And the primary diagnosis for this problem of algorithmic discrimination has been the biased data diagnosis. The biased data diagnosis refers to the idea that these algorithms reproduce existing inequities because they're built and trained on racially and socioeconomically inequitable data. And resultingly, they produce racially and socioeconomically inequitable outcomes. In other words, bias in, bias out. It's true that biased data is one reason for algorithmic discrimination. Another reason is that these algorithms also have what I call a data source selection problem. They are trained with data that is exclusively derived from criminal legal institutions, or what I call carceral knowledge sources. And at this point of the talk, I want to turn to this data source selection problem and discuss the kinds of data that are generated from carceral knowledge sources exclusively used in algorithmic construction. By so doing, this will set us up to think about the limits of understanding algorithmic discrimination as simply a problem of biased data. So developers utilize exclusively data derived from carceral knowledge sources. And by invoking the term carceral knowledge sources, I'm referring to knowledge sources implicated in the political and social systems that facilitate the punishment, containment, and surveillance of individuals. In the pretrial context, developers utilize three kinds of carceral knowledge sources: the police, pretrial service agencies, and the court system. And it's important to consider these sources as knowledge sources because these sources produce knowledge about individuals that interact with these institutions. And in turn, they produce knowledge about public safety that drives criminal law policy as well as criminal law practice. In recent years, we've seen a rise in social movements such as Black Lives Matter, which have challenged the conception of public safety that the knowledge produced by carceral knowledge sources justifies and legitimates. So at this point, I want to go through the kinds of data produced by carceral knowledge sources that are currently utilized in the construction of pretrial algorithms. So the first carceral knowledge source is the police. And there are two kinds of data produced from policing that are important for pretrial algorithmic construction. The first is arrest data. The second concerns information produced during police stops that do not lead to an arrest. And both kinds of data consist of personal information about an individual. In the case of an arrest, that information includes the circumstances that led to the arrest, as well as the alleged crime to which the individual was arrested for. The second carceral knowledge source used in pretrial algorithmic construction is data produced by pretrial service agencies. This data is produced by pretrial service agents. Pretrial service agencies are tasked by a jurisdiction to collect personal information about a defendant. And much of the information that pretrial service agencies collect are similar to the kinds of data that police officers collect. However, there's an important difference in the sense that pretrial service agencies collect information about a defendant's mental health history, community ties, and familial situation. The final carceral knowledge source used in pretrial algorithmic construction is data produced by the court system. Courts produce two kinds of data that are important for this purpose. The first kind of data are convictions, and the second kind of data are bench warrants. All data produced by these carceral knowledge sources are inputted into databases and relied upon by all aspects of the criminal legal system. And developers obtain this data from these sources, usually in an anonymized and aggregated form. Now, there are many problems with exclusively utilizing these carceral knowledge sources within algorithmic construction. They routinely produce inaccurate data and incomplete data, but more importantly, for our purposes, the data produced by carceral knowledge sources is well established to be racially and socioeconomically inequitable. And this is because the criminal legal system is disproportionately concentrated on poor and racially marginalized communities. The data produced by these knowledge sources reflect these racial and class disproportionalities. And this brings us to the issue of algorithmic discrimination and the biased data diagnosis. There is a consensus that algorithms discriminate, and that this discrimination is caused by the fact that these algorithms are constructed and trained with biased data. So bias in, bias out. And the biased data diagnosis has spurred a number of strategies designed to combat algorithmic discrimination. And these strategies have focused on the data currently used in algorithmic systems. I'm going to focus on 3 of these approaches to show how approaches emanating from the biased data diagnosis are incapable on their own of redressing the data source selection problem, and resultingly cannot on their own correct algorithmic discrimination. The first approach is what I call the better data approach. The better data approach advocates for the use of more complete and representative data sets in algorithmic construction. But to be clear, this approach is focused on getting better data from currently used knowledge sources, so getting better data from carceral knowledge sources. The second approach that emanates from the biased data diagnosis is the technical adjustment approach. This approach advocates for technically adjusting the algorithm so as to address the fact that the algorithm was built on biased data. One example is the colorblind approach, in which data that is heavily associated with racially or socioeconomically inequitable outcomes is excluded from the data set or hidden from the algorithm. Another approach is algorithmic affirmative action. And both these strategies aim to counteract the fact that the algorithm is producing racially inequitable outputs. The third approach that comes from the biased data diagnosis is the auditing approach. This approach advocates for measuring the inequitable impact that the use of an algorithm has in a jurisdiction. The idea being that the information can empower a jurisdiction to discontinue the use of or try to figure out adjustments for the fact that an algorithm is maintaining existing inequities. Though all these 3 approaches are substantial improvements over the status quo, the problem is that with these strategies is that they fail to contend with the carceral knowledge sources that are an essential component of algorithmic discrimination. And by leaving intact the dominance of carceral knowledge sources in algorithmic construction, these approaches cannot fully contend with algorithmic discrimination. The inability of existing approaches to correct algorithmic discrimination raises the question of what should we do? One approach would be to abolish the use of pretrial algorithms, which some scholars have suggested. Another approach would be to repurpose pretrial algorithms, which some scholars have also suggested. And if the only data legible or credible for use in algorithmic systems are from carceral knowledge sources, then we should either abolish or repurpose pretrial algorithms. But data from carceral knowledge sources is not the only data out there. There is data from non-carceral knowledge sources. And if we want to redress algorithmic discrimination, we need to shift away from carceral knowledge sources and tap into non-carceral knowledge sources. And in the paper that this talk is based on, I explore data produced and validated by communities most impacted by the criminal legal system, which I call community knowledge sources, as a potential non-carceral knowledge source worth utilizing in algorithmic construction. And data from community knowledge sources have traditionally been excluded and discredited in algorithmic construction. And the reason for this has been because of epistemic oppression. Dominant knowledge production and validation processes discount the knowledge produced by subordinated communities, such as communities most impacted by the criminal legal system. So the data produced by these communities has been discredited and deemed not credible for algorithmic construction. And this discrediting of community knowledge stems from the racial and class dynamics in society that have disabled those from subordinated groups from equally contributing to knowledge production. And this discrediting serves racial ends and facilitates the creation of algorithms that reproduce the racial and class status quo that we have today. My proposal is that we dismantle the dominance of carceral knowledge sources in algorithmic construction and shift to non-carceral knowledge sources. One category of non-carceral knowledge sources that warrants attention is community knowledge sources. One example of this kind of data of the kind of data produced by community knowledge sources concerns the qualitative data produced by formerly and currently incarcerated people hailing from communities most impacted by the criminal legal system. Community groups representing most impacted communities have often been at the center of the collection and dissemination of this qualitative data. Some of those organizations are National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, as well as Safe and Just Michigan. And the qualitative data produced by formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people has been critical in unearthing the harms of the current system of pretrial incarceration and has enabled a reckoning about the ways that our current pretrial system pursues a conceptualization of public safety that fails to protect the safety of defendants, their families, and communities that have been impacted severely by the system. And in terms of benefits of shifting to community knowledge sources, tapping to these sources would redress the epistemic oppression faced by communities that have been excluded from dominant knowledge production and validation processes and have, as a result, been unable to meaningfully structure our understanding of the pretrial system and its impact on their communities. And this is important because this epistemic oppression has facilitated a pretrial system that often maintains the political, social, and economic hardships of over-incarceration on most impacted communities. But tapping into the data produced by these community knowledge sources could fix this. It has the potential of enabling a reconceptualization of public safety, one in which accounts for the harms of the pretrial system. In so doing, this conceptualization of public safety could provide a realistic assessment of what's at stake when it comes to pretrial incarceration. And in future work, I plan to explore ways in which algorithmic construction can tap into community knowledge sources and how we could create a new institutional structures and arrangements designed around utilizing these community knowledge sources. At the same time, there are objections to my proposal, and I'm happy to discuss those objections more when we get to Q&A, but I want to preview two of those objections now. So one of those objections is the accuracy objection. The accuracy objection is that algorithms that are built on data from community knowledge sources will be less accurate than algorithms built on data from carceral knowledge sources. And the response to this objection is that we need to rethink what we mean by accuracy. Accuracy has to be understood within the context of what we want to achieve with the pretrial system and how we understand public safety. Given this, tapping into community knowledge sources can enable us to enhance our understanding of public safety. And in that way, it actually might make these algorithms more accurate because it can enable them to be constructed on an understanding of public safety that takes into account realistically the harms and benefits of pretrial incarceration, thus ultimately enhancing public safety. The second objection is the democratizing objection. The democratizing objection concerns the fear that data derived from community knowledge sources will not be less biased and may in fact be more biased. And if relied upon, using community knowledge could usher in a more punitive system. And it's true that shifting to non-carceral knowledge sources, such as community knowledge sources, does not guarantee a specific or particular outcome, and shifting to community knowledge sources alone may not be a complete solution to algorithmic discrimination. However, it's only through dismantling the dominance of carceral knowledge sources that we can begin to think our way through addressing algorithmic discrimination. Moreover, there is a reason for optimism, especially when we think about social movements on the ground, as well as the community groups that are at the center of the collection of community knowledge. Given that, and given the racist and classist quality of the data produced by carceral knowledge sources, it's worth making this shift. To conclude, there's agreement that the harm of algorithmic discrimination threatens the ability of algorithmic systems to redress current inequities. If we're serious about addressing algorithmic discrimination, then we have to look beyond the biases in the data that we currently use to build these algorithmic systems and instead contend with the knowledge sources at the heart of algorithmic construction. Correcting algorithmic discrimination might be possible, but its redress requires a paradigmatic shift away from carceral knowledge sources. Perhaps pretrial algorithms and other criminal legal technologies offer a path to radically reorienting the criminal legal system in a way that would decrease the harms that the system currently enacts on racially marginalized people in their communities. But unlocking that potential requires dismantling the knowledge sources that brought us here in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's really, really interesting. I think these are applause hands coming, but not yet raised hands. But we're a small enough group that I think we should be able to sort of informally do the Q&A. I'm happy to moderate as needed, but I'd like to invite the folks who have questions either unmute and say them or raise your hand or whatever seems to work best. Okay, too many questions. So I don't mind taking the moderator privilege and leading off. It struck me, so one of the more interesting kind of machine learning AI literatures is about target variables in the case of medicine. I'm thinking of Ziad Obermeyer's work specifically. And so they did this paper, and it was a hospital system that was trying to figure out a way to triage and get better, single phone number to call, manage care for the really fragile patients who have long lists of conditions. And it turned out that the algorithm that was designed to facilitate that was sending white patients to the triage, but not black ones, right? So it was a similar sort of racial bias. And what they figured out is that they were using the target variable they had to optimize was based around billing codes, which does tell you how much care someone's getting at the hospital. But of course, if black patients have less access to the medical system, then it's going to underrepresent them because they picked the wrong target variable. So that's a long way of asking, do you think that part of the problem here is that we're accepting carceral data as a proxy for public safety, and that's a mistaken approach.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I I agree with that, and one of the things I think is really one of the things I was trying to do with this paper is really contend with the fact that the kind of data that is being drawn upon by developers with respect to problem formation is important to figuring out what that target variable was going to be in the first place. And so the exclusive use of carceral data has led to a problem formation in which the target variable is just non-appearance and arrest for pretrial crime, when in fact bail judges themselves don't only take into account carceral data when thinking about this broader question of public safety, and have themselves taken into account the fact that someone is the particular harm that pretrial incarceration might cause, which has led historically for bail judges to take into effect that someone is the primary caregiver of a minor child, for instance. But at the same time, I do think that another component of this as well has to do with the fact that we could even say that such data, such as the fact that someone is the primary caregiver of a minor child, actually goes to the question of pretrial flight risk or non-appearance risk. The idea being that someone who has parental obligations is less likely to flee the jurisdiction because of that. And so on some level, what we're seeing is a problem at the problem formation level, but we're also seeing a problem with respect to the kinds of data that actually, if we just keep the problem formation as just non-appearance and arrest for pretrial crime as a problem too, because of the fact that only carceral data is being utilized.
Great, thanks. Doug, I think your hand is first.
Thanks. This is Doug Haig. I run the School of Data Science here, and I love the thought process that you're going through around using non-carceral data. But my brain's starting to run on what is that data, right? I mean, it's community, but where is it? And you said there's some objections, potential objections to it. But until you kind of see what the data is, and can you just talk about more what it would actually be and what you would be requesting to be using in that? I mean, I don't know. I think it's a great way to approach it, but I have no idea what we would be collecting to be able to do it that way.
No, that's a great question. And it's something that I have been trying to think through in future work. But what I'm really interested in when I'm invoking this idea of non-carceral data is to think about, and non-carceral data sources, is to think about data that's not necessary for the current functioning of the criminal legal system. And I'm interested in community data specifically because I think of it as subjugated knowledge that has, for epistemic reasons, not been taken into account, not only by the criminal legal system, but in our society more generally, in terms of how to actually get at that knowledge. The first part I've been thinking about is to think about communities that have been, and in terms of when I'm thinking about community knowledge, I'm specifically thinking about communities that have been most impacted by the criminal legal system. And there is data with respect to zip codes, about zip codes that have a large number of people who go in and out of the criminal legal system. So that's a way of identifying this community. In terms of the actual collection of it, I talked about a little bit in this talk, and I talked about in the paper, community groups that are already in these communities and trying to and have been collecting and disseminating this data for the purposes of discussing the harms of the criminal legal system. But I take your point that we might say that that's not enough. I mean, one of the reasons for which developers use data from carceral knowledge sources is because it's available and it's cheap. I put cheap in quotes because the state pays for it, right? It's state sponsored. And so in order to move toward community knowledge sources in algorithmic construction, we need to invest in it. And so that the question becomes having an institutional framework designed around that. There's been some really great work about participatory research approaches. We could think about funding those. I've also thought through the idea of thinking about kind of utilizing a community jury kind of structure where those in these communities are given the opportunity with payment to actually give their knowledge about public safety, and the way we kind of have we have juries. And so, but these are, of course, things that I'm thinking through in my next paper, which is called Beyond Carceral Data. And so I'm still, thinking through these questions myself.
Yeah, I mean, I go to, well, you can collect Twitter data and all of that, but that's just as bad. Sometimes as the carceral data, it's Twitter data, Facebook, right? The things that are readily available are almost as bad. But then I'm going, well, they're church, faith-based records. But then you're invading, how much privacy are you willing to give up to be able to do this? And so that's where my mind starts twisting around. But thank you, and I look forward to hearing where this goes.
And I think you're right about that. I mean, the first step I take is that we have to think about community buy-in, right? I mean, communities may not even want to do this. But the second part in thinking about privacy is something else I'm thinking about in Beyond Carceral Data, my Beyond Carceral Data paper, is to think about how we might utilize the idea of trust to be able to protect this data, how we might use zero proof knowledge with respect to the creation of the algorithm, so that the result might be available, but the underlying data that made that result is not available. So there are ways of thinking through how to protect privacy with respect to this shift. But I agree with you that it's something that has to be taken into account.
Thanks. Lisa?
Hi, excuse me, I'll jump in. Thank you so much. That was great. And I agree. Actually, I have the same question as Doug did. And the same praise, which is that thinking about carceral knowledge systems will be really helpful, I think, going forward. So let me kind of try and pick on an aspect of your answer to Doug, because I was trying to think about mechanistically, pragmatically, how does this work? And you mentioned community juries. And so then I started to wonder whether maybe what we're saying is just, it's the algorithm that's the problem, right? And of course it has the biased data, but that the only way to counteract it might be something more nuanced and contextual and qualitative, not quantitative. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, as you're thinking about your next steps with the project, to think about the qualitative versus quantitative versions, right? Or are you just totally rejecting the quantitative versions? Because people want this to be easy. And as you said, cheap in quotes, right? Just means somebody else is paying the price. I mean, do we just need to do away with the algorithm? Or are there ways you can think of that would counteract that? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in some level, what I raise could be just understood as just a critique of using algorithms altogether. And I fall short of advocating for that, not only because I think that in many ways the algorithmic turn is inevitable, we're going in that direction, but also because algorithms didn't inaugurate the problem of these inequities to begin with. And so I am not at the point yet where I think that algorithms are completely inconsistent with racial justice. I also am not sure that it's impossible to think through the idea of utilizing qualitative data alongside quantitative data. I don't believe that we should completely stop using quantitative data. And the reason I say that is because developers do take into account the data of system actors. So I didn't talk about this in the talk, but for instance, Pennsylvania has a sentencing algorithm that it created, and in the creation of it, developers interviewed prosecutors and defense lawyers as well as judges with respect to that. So developers have figured out ways to get qualitative data from system insiders. They also, of course, consult with the jurisdiction in question if they've targeted the algorithm to a particular jurisdiction. Sometimes it's not the case, but if they have. And so what I'm noticing is that there seems to be an exclusion of trying to engage in a similar way with respect to community data at the construction level, and that's what I'm pushing for. But I take your point that it's hard to, and this is something I'm trying to develop in future work, think through, what is this algorithm going to look like? But I do think already we have pretrial algorithms that are the product of qualitative and quantitative data if we actually think through how the construction actually works and what developers are doing in terms of what kinds of data they're drawing from in constructing it.
Thanks. Kingston?
Thank you. First off, like everyone else has mentioned, thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciate it. And we do seem to be hounding you on more like these material questions because we're trying to wrap our head around, I think, because we're all kind of committed to recognizing this work and how we would do it. So I guess my question is kind of going to where you're taking this work in the future, is how have you thought through, or how far are you along in kind of tapping in developers into these community groups to start, because like what I'm assuming here is this non-carceral data. In order to be able to use it, you would kind of need it in kind of the scale and de-aggregateness per like jurisdiction that you have the carceral data. So have you considered or having talks about folks volunteering in support of these community groups sort of creating data in a way that could eventually be used to fit into an algorithm, if that makes sense?
No, that's a great question, and thank you for it. So something I've been thinking about in the Beyond Carceral Data paper I'm writing has been, require if a jurisdiction required that for a pretrial algorithm to be used in the first place, it has to have been constructed with community data. That, I think, is a way of incentivizing developers to create these types of strategies. Some pretrial algorithms are actually created by jurisdictions themselves, though most jurisdictions use an off-the-shelf algorithm. New York City, for instance, actually created its own pretrial algorithm in partnership with a nonprofit organization as well as a private organization. And so I think that in those particular situations, you can imagine funding for community groups that are already collecting this kind of knowledge as well. But I take your point that in order for this to happen, there has to be a financial investment in it. On the other side, and this goes kind of to this point of getting developers in contact with community groups. There are community groups that are actively trying to get into algorithmic governance. Particularly, there's a community justice exchange, which is a group of community organizations, many of which are abolitionist adjacent, that have created this handbook of try as a how-to for community groups to actually engage in algorithmic governance. And I talk about this a little bit in the past paper, Democratizing Potential of Algorithms, where I talk about how there are spaces in which communities can essentially, in which jurisdictions have provided for public input with respect to algorithms, but it's not the algorithmic construction level. It's usually at the level of after the algorithm has been made, questions around whether the algorithm should be implemented, and how these processes being ex post the actual algorithm being constructed, and also in some ways not meaningful in the sense that the community groups are not able to actually stop the algorithm from, in fact, being implemented. I discussed the problems with that in my prior work. But the point of raising it is just to suggest that many community groups are already thinking about this. So trying to figure out how to get developers to be able to connect with community groups is actually a lot easier than I think than people realize with respect to that. And that also gets me to think again about why are we not seeing this already happen when we already do have community groups that are trying to get involved at various levels of algorithmic governance.
Oh, so yeah, thank you for your answer. And yeah, I agree to that. One of the kind of biggest points or things we could do is find some ways to kind of mandate that they do need to have kind of community buy-in before they can put these algorithms into place. So thank you for that point.
Yeah, and of course, I think what comes from that is, you know, if we make that requirement, it might mean that we see less pretrial algorithms, right? And that is something that can come from my prescription. But of course, I think that that's fine because of the fact that the algorithms that we're seeing that are with that exclusion are the kinds of algorithms that reproduce the racial and class status quo in a way that seems objective and makes it actually harder to contest the harms that these technologies produce on these communities.
Yeah, thank you. Nico?
Hi, and thanks again for the talk. It was, like everyone said, fascinating. So when we're talking about community knowledge sources versus carceral knowledge sources, one thing that it seemed was kind of an assumption or was at least embedded in that difference was the way that the legal system or algorithms kind of epistemically smooth over some of the particularities that community knowledge sources would generate. And I guess my question is, in what ways does the contemporary legal system need to change in conjunction with the way we do data and the way we change the way we handle personal data in order to make this not a bad system? At the very bare minimum, I'm just curious about how much of a difficulty is that with the way that these things are kind of built up on the ground, and moving forward down the road, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I take your question to sort of, move us beyond just the question of algorithms, but more around just how epistemic oppression operates just within systems of power, right? So the idea that within the criminal legal system itself, there is this epistemic oppression. And I talk about, actually just in a footnote in my paper, about the fact that, when it comes to the pretrial service agencies, in doing these kinds of interviews with defendants, the types of questions that are asked, what is actually taken down, right? If the defendant doesn't respond in a way that is coherent within a carceral way of understanding public safety, it doesn't form part of the record. And so it's a form of epistemically objectifying of the defendant, to the point that we would say that defendant is not actually having their knowledge necessarily become part of how we understand public safety. So I think that my paper and this project has implications outside of just algorithms. But at the same time, I take from your point that we do live in this system, right? And so on some level, when we think about the question of turning to subjugated knowledge, we can't say what that knowledge will in fact be, or necessarily presume that knowledge will be completely the opposite of the kinds of knowledge that the carceral system is producing. The carceral system is quite central to our thinking about public safety. And so, the turn doesn't particularly lead to a particular kind of outcome. But I do think, and Professor Mary Masuda talks about this, that the actual being oppressed, being the subject of the system does provide a particular view of seeing the world that doesn't come from someone who isn't similarly oppressed. And so standpoint matters. And so in thinking about this question of how we could get subjugated knowledge more generally to be a part of systems of power, I think the first part of that is to actually, think through the question that it is knowledge itself. I think that one of the reasons, that community knowledge is not used in algorithmic construction is because it's deemed not data, it's deemed not knowledge. And similarly speaking, I think that happens in the context of how we understand this knowledge with respect to systems of power. So the actual process of reckoning with it as knowledge that is able to meaningfully contribute is a part of it, and that requires a societal shift. And the second part, of course, is making systems that can actually utilize that knowledge. Systems that don't currently exist. So I also take you to be pointing us to the need for new institutional structures as opposed to just the maintenance of the structures that we have.
Awesome, thank you. Very interesting.
So what kind of, this is, James, I'll call on you instead.
Hi, thank you for speaking. So I kind of want to play off of your answer a little bit and the direction that you were headed with that, because it seems likely that we can develop algorithms that are going to be correct largely correct in the function that they were programmed to perform. And when they're not correct, it should stand out as an outlier under a well-designed system. Even if we're not like quite there by and large, it seems likely that we will within the near future. So for me, it raises the question, it's a question of application. At what point is the systemic bias and inequalities too much for the algorithm to deal with, that it's just going to, where the concern becomes the algorithm is getting it right, and that's also increasing inequalities that on vulnerable populations. And then from there, I think we have to look at when algorithms are even applied. I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that.
No, I think, no, that's a great point. You know, one of the things I was hoping to do with this project is to really challenge what we mean by accuracy. And by that, I mean that I think that one of the issues with respect to thinking about the question of algorithmic discrimination, thinking about algorithms generally, is that we have to always think about the fact that algorithms are designed within a particular ideology, designed to facilitate a particular kind of project. And that kind of project in the context of public safety has been very narrowly defined as just the functioning of the criminal legal system and the question of crime. And I think that, you know, if we think about engaging with community knowledge on the level of just problem formation of what we mean by public safety, as well as, and this is not just an algorithm problem, I think it's a system problem too. The criminal legal system actually thinks about the question of public safety outside of just a question of crime and the administration of the criminal legal system, then we get towards bigger questions, such as, well, if we actually want to provide for public safety, and Professor Angela Davis talks about this, you know, we would say that poverty and destabilization of particular communities is actually how we how crime actually tends to happen. So if we actually want to stop interpersonal violence, then we should be deploying resources to certain communities financially or otherwise, as opposed to containment or surveillance. And so I think that in terms of thinking about these systemic inequities, I do think it comes at the problem formation level. And I think that if we actually move towards other ways of understanding safety that get us away from just containment and surveillance and actually get us towards redistribution of resources, then we can imagine having algorithms that are accurate, that don't actually cause specific harms to certain communities. But if we don't actually engage with redistribution, and we don't think broadly about public safety, and we only think about this narrowly, then any accurate algorithm within that context will reproduce existing inequities.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks. So a little bit of follow-up on that, and I take the point that, well, we don't know what subjugated knowledges are because, well, they're subjugated, right? No one's had a chance to articulate that. But there is data out there, like census data and other data that would tell you what communities, for example, are economically very disadvantaged. Presumably there's data out there about household composition, and you'd be able to you can imagine now rather saying, okay, this person is likely to be the primary provider for children and so on. So how much, maybe there's not a good answer to this, but how much are we looking at the need to better use existing data versus going out and producing new kinds of data? Because I imagine as getting your foot in the door sort of reform, if you can say, well, this census data would help, right? People say, oh, okay, good, that's cheap data too, right? And so it's a different kind of approach. I'm just wondering if you think there's where the limits are between those as approaches.
I think that's fair. On one level, one of my concerns is just moving away from the data that is currently used to facilitate the functioning of the criminal legal system. And so I'm not opposed to thinking about other data that's not community data. But one of the things that I'm really thinking through in this project and in future work is this question of how important standpoint perspectives are. So essentially, one thing I've been thinking about is that we could say, well, you don't need to turn to community knowledge sources to know that there's a relationship between the parental loss of custody of a parent and pretrial incarceration. There is sociological studies on that. But what I think happens with respect to subjugated knowledge, and I'm going to use the example of the harms of policing to racially marginalized communities, is that there's something about subjugated knowledge that actually gets us further to understand these harms and can be understood outside of these communities. So for instance, right now we're in a reckoning around the violence of policing, and it's finally started to permeate dominant knowledge production and validation processes. But we still see that how police violence is understood tends to be in terms of how physically violent it is, as opposed to reckoning with its political harms, economic harms, and harms on social kinship networks. And so I think that on some level, there's just certain kinds of knowledge that we can't duplicate through dominant knowledge production and validation processes. Even though I do agree that certain kinds of knowledge that are currently not being used in algorithmic construction or currently not being used in the criminal legal system might get us to a better point than where we are right now.
Okay, thanks. There's a question in the chat. Are any states or agencies currently using non-carceral data for other purposes within the justice system?
Non-carceral data with respect to other purposes. So I've defined non-carceral data as just data that's not used with respect to the functioning of the criminal legal system. And so with respect to that, yes, there has been some use of zip codes, for instance, which are data that's not produced by the criminal legal system and is not currently used with respect to the criminal legal outcomes generally. That being said, in some ways, that actually leads me towards why I focus so much on community knowledge, because just because a particular kind of data isn't produced by carceral knowledge sources and tends not to be used by the criminal legal system as it stands, doesn't mean that actually gets us to less biased or less racially inequitable outcomes, because the use of zip codes tends to actually facilitate racial inequities. So that's an important part in thinking through the turn to non-carceral knowledge sources as well.
Sorry, Kingston, unmute there.
Yeah, I had kind of like a general question, just to take it out because I was interested. Was it just your particular interest, or was there a reason why your focus is kind of on the pretrial use of algorithms? Is that just, I was thinking maybe that's where you think that there's more impact, if we could find ways to fix bias there, or if there were other reasons.
Yeah, so, I thought, so the reason I focused on pretrial algorithms is threefold. I mean, my research has tended to be in the pretrial arena, but also one of the things I think is really interesting is that pretrial algorithms are quite simple in terms of the kinds of algorithms that are used in our society, and so it's a really interesting case study of how we can actually start to think about what the kinds of data we're using actually does with respect to an algorithmic system. So I saw it as a really good entry point to thinking through this question of how to turn away from carceral knowledge sources.
Great, thank you.
So is there any move towards algorithms being used at like sentencing? Because that's the other place where there's like this, the federal sentencing guidelines are this huge mess and no one understands them, and judges think they're wrong anyway. And so I can imagine somebody saying, well, gee, here's a place for data.
Yeah, so sentencing algorithms are being used. Professor Jessica Eaglin writes a lot about sentencing algorithms. Sentencing algorithms are used very specifically with respect to the purpose of recidivism, which is only one component of thinking through sentencing. So the relationship between what the sentence ultimately is as it pertains to the outcome of the algorithm isn't as closely connected as it is in the pretrial context. But you're right, it is being used in that context. My argument with respect to pretrial algorithms equally applies to sentencing algorithms. The only difference is that sentencing algorithms tend not to use data from pretrial service agencies, but it's similarly exclusively using carceral knowledge sources.
If we're all out of questions or everyone's starving to death or something, it's lunchtime, right? Then why don't you join me in thanking Ngozi for her talk?
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the questions. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate you all taking the time.
Speaking for myself, it was my pleasure. Yeah, it's great to hear the talk. Okay, well, so don't everyone forget about Karen Levy in a couple of weeks, and we'll be pushing out, promotional materials on that soon. Otherwise, everybody have a good afternoon. Thanks.